That was done in an hour. Just be called in.
What was that?
So still in your mind.
Oh.
Hey, well. Okay, I call to order the Joint Planning Commission and City Council work session of January 30th, 2023. Shall we call to order and pledge of allegiance?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. May I have the roll call, please?
Commissioner Miller,
Here.
Commissioner Cardoza,
Present.
Commissioner Nepperud has an excused absence, and Commissioner Bunch,
Good evening.
Commissioner Bartholomew,
Yes. It's not working. Yes.
Commissioner Hunsaker, here, Commissioner Riles, Commissioner Green, and Commissioner Verba.
Here.
Counselor Newton,
Present.
Counselor Novak has an excused absence, Counselor Montague,
Here.
Counselor Kopsinski,
Here.
Counselor McGee,
Present.
Counselor Smith,
Here.
and Mayor Johnson II.
Here.
Thank you so much, staff. Okay, scheduled business is the East Albany Area Plan, and I will turn it over to Ann.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, and new members. We appreciate you being here. And I'm Ann Catlin. I work in the City Community Development Department. And for many of you, we have gone over some materials, but we'll catch all of the newer people up to speed. But I wanted to introduce our consultants that are here today. We have Matt Hasty with MIG and Andrew Parrish with MIG, and they will be walking through most of our updates with a lot of the material that was presented in your packet this time. And I'll pop in as needed. And we know that some of you have dinner and things like that after this. So we're going to try to move things along, but at any time, feel free to ask questions. And Matt, I'll hand it over and you can add to that.
All right, thanks, Ann. Yeah, so Andrew and I are I'll share my screen in a moment, and we're going to walk through a presentation that summarizes the materials that we sent out to y'all in advance of the meeting. We'll kind of stop and pause along the way during the presentation. We won't make you wait until the end to ask questions and get your feedback and reactions to things. So we'll kind of pause at a number of points along the way and see if you have questions or comments or suggestions for us. I am going, and Andrew and I will kind of tag team the presentation. I'll end up doing a pretty good chunk up front, and then Andrew will cover kind of the third almost, and I'll do the last bit. And like Ann said, she'll chime in with questions or comments. Other staff may do the same. So that's kind of how we'll go through this. So I will share my screen and get us started on that. All right, so can everybody see that? Okay, is everybody seeing the kind of the agenda for the presentation? Okay, so as I said, we'll kind of pause along the way. I'll start out with kind of a quick status report on just kind of where we are in the process. This process has been going on for a while. We're actually kind of getting towards the tail end. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And then in terms of planning analysis and recommendations, we'll talk about recommendations very briefly related to land use planning. We'll talk about that more towards sort of the end of that section as well. Talk about transportation, facility recommendations, other infrastructure, water, wastewater, stormwater, and then we'll talk about recommended amendments to the city's comprehensive plan and zoning map and development code. Talk a little bit about strategies. How does all this get paid for? Some of the things you'll see in the presentation, and then finish it up with next steps. And again, we'll stop along the way and pause kind of after each of those items and see if y'all have questions and comments for us. There's a couple things we really definitely want to get your input on, really all of it, but there's one thing I think in particular where we want to make sure you weigh in. So in terms of a status report, again, we're kind of heading towards the tail end of this project. We've been working on it for over a year. We've gone through a pretty iterative process with members of our project advisory committee, with work sessions with you all. We've had a couple of rounds of stakeholder group meetings, as well as just sort of broad outreach to the community in the form of project webpage, online survey, community meetings, and then a lot of just conversation with property owners that staff has undertaken. So there have been a lot of just individual comments and conversations along the way as well. So what we provided in advance of this meeting is sort of a series of memos that embody the recommendations that will go into a draft of the East Albany plan. So we met with our advisory committee to review all of this last week. We're meeting with you tonight. We will take results of those two meetings and make any needed refinements we need to those recommendations, and then prepare a draft of the East Albany plan, have additional community review of that, and then we will be back to you in March and August for public hearings for adoption of the East Albany plan and the implementing comp plan and code amendments that we'll talk about later tonight in March with the Planning Commission, April with the council. And that's when our funding and contract with the state, who provided funding for this project, and it goes until the end of April. So we have a kind of a hard stop on this. So that's kind of where we are in the process and what the next steps are. So I will say just a little bit more, and then I'll take a pause and see if you have any questions for me or others. So we've got a graphic here that you saw in your packet that just gives you sort of a visual sense of the kind of nature of long-term development in East Albany based on this plan. This is pretty conceptual, and it's really a long build-out period. You know, it's a long time to achieve this plan. This is sort of more growth and development than is projected even in the next 20 years. A lot of this will happen as private property owners propose to annex their properties into the city. That's how a lot of this growth and development will occur. So this is not anticipated to happen overnight or even in the next 5 to 10 years. It's really kind of a long-term process. Kind of underlying this image and other parts of the plan is this land use plan. And as a lot of you will remember, we went through a process of identifying different land use alternatives, evaluating those alternatives, refining those alternatives based on all of the different discussion processes and points that I mentioned a moment ago. And so this map gives you a sense of what the proposed land uses or types of development would look like in this area. The kind of, I'll say, light yellow to maybe orange represent different intensities of residential use primarily. The purple represents employment uses, and employment uses could be a variety of different types of employment. We'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation. Red represents commercial development, and kind of the brown areas, kind of smaller areas, represent a mixed use. So a mix of typically housing and shopping and other kinds of commercial uses. And the point in a lot of this is really to kind of provide people with a lot of opportunities to do different things throughout East Albany. So it'll help them get to places more easily, not have to travel as far to do that. So that's the land use plan. I think before I talk about transportation recommendations, maybe I'll just stop and see if you all have any questions or comments up to this point, recognizing we'll talk a little bit more about the land use stuff later in the presentation. All good for now. I can see you all, but I can't see your faces well enough to know if you're.
You can continue on that, no question.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So I'll talk a little bit about transportation. I'm going to show you a number of slides related to transportation. And I should note, we have other folks on our team who specialize in this area in transportation. And so they've really conducted all this work. So I'm kind of channeling them tonight. So this is a map of the proposed street network in the area. And the solid lines are, the solid gray lines are essentially existing roadways. The dashed lines are proposed future new roadways. And I'll say just kind of a couple of things here. One, the main sort of point of adding new roadways is to create essentially a basic framework or system of connectivity throughout the area, so that people aren't having to travel too far out of direction to get to places, so that they can easily get to other parts of East Albany and then to other parts of Albany more generally. There's a couple of things I'll point out in terms of some recommended changes to existing roadways in another slide in a moment. But generally, we're showing, again, the existing system and those new roadways and the dashed lines. So I'm going to go to the next slide. This is showing a network of trails and pathways throughout East Albany. The solid kind of, I'll call that magenta lines, are potential off-street trails or pathways. Those are generally intended to parallel creek corridors or other open space corridors. And then the dashed lines represent on-street bicycle or pedestrian pathways. Those could be bicycle lanes within a roadway, or they could be an off-street multi-use pathway as well. So again, the assumption is, and the recommendations are, to create a system that provides kind of mobility and connections for all types of travelers, whether you're driving or walking or bicycling. And kind of the next couple of slides show you some more of the specifics of this. So this slide is showing some proposed changes to the street network in the vicinity, kind of north and south of Highway 20. And in this image, north is kind of off to your right. So we've kind of flipped the direction a little bit here. And west is kind of going upwards on the diagram. So I think the things I want to point out here are that given the kind of operation and constraints on Interstate 5's connections to Highway 20, the assumption is that Price Road in particular will ultimately be a right in, right out kind of roadway. You won't be able to take make left turns off of that onto Highway 20 and kind of vice versa. And to address that and make sure that there is the ability to get from the areas around Price Road without going too far out of direction and get back over to Highway 20, the proposal is to install a signal at the intersection of Timber Street and Highway 20, and then create this connection north of Highway 20 from there up to Price Road. Also to improve the connection from that roadway, essentially along or parallel to Blue Ox Drive over to Goldfish Farm Road, so that you maintain kind of connectivity and the ability for people to travel within that area, recognizing some of the constraints on those intersections that relate to the performance of both Interstate 5 and Highway 20. And then you also, south of Highway 20, see some proposed changes to kind of the transportation framework or system in there, with a proposed new roundabout at the kind of that southern end of the north-south section of Timber Road, with a connection from there over to Three Lakes Drive, and then with Spicer Drive essentially not connecting directly to Three Lakes to the south there. So that's a proposed change to your existing system, and to again kind of reflect future conditions in this area, but to maintain connectivity for folks who are traveling within that area and who, own businesses or live or going to destinations in that area. So I'm going to stop there and I think that's something we particularly wanted to just see if you have any feedback or questions about. And I'll also say that, I don't know, I think Ron Irish is here tonight. And if he is, he can add to what I said, or he might be able to answer questions as well. So, but I will stop there and see if you have any comments or questions about that.
No comments or questions. ma'am. And
Yes, Ron is unable to be here this evening, and this map image here represents some decision points that we need a direction from you about. I think the decision and policy direction is when Interstate 5 improvements are made at the highway, Santiam Highway 20, that will impact Price Road. And this is showing right in or right out. It might be a dead end, but we will need to reroute traffic from Price Road east, either over to Timber Street and also over to Goldfish Farm Road. And like I said, possibly dead ending Price Road. And I think the question is whether you support this general plan idea, knowing that the roads may be aligned a little differently. This was a conceptual map image. Or if you want to wait and make that decision when it gets closer to knowing the time frame for that interchange improvement. Just to let you know, we don't know when ODOT will have enough funding to make the Interstate 5 interchange improvements. It could be they have enough funding within 5 or 10 years. It could be longer. And so but we're trying to plan ahead and trying to work with property owners. And this is our best proposal to bring forward to try to provide connectivity for all. And so we would like your input and thoughts on that tonight.
I was contacted by a handful of residents in the area talking about Price Road in particular. I think that's one of the most visible spots for people who travel Highway 20 now, and they're concerned about truck traffic and so on. I think this is a good solution, particularly keeping in mind that potential for I-5 getting that third lane. It's going to happen someday. Many of us may not live that long. I don't know. It could be forever. But we talked about this a little bit when we met with Representative Bosshart Davis last week at the Capitol. She is a firm supporter of the 3 lanes for the highway as well. And so that's all top of mind. She lives in the area and is familiar with traffic patterns. I think this looks reasonable, particularly with the addition of getting Timber Street all the way through. And everybody, if you don't know it now, you will before my term is over. I love roundabouts. So I think that's a good way of keeping things moving on the other side. This provides a little more protection for residential areas in the neighborhood, separates them from some of the heavier traffic. If Ron says those signals are far enough apart to meet the will of the ODOT gods, then I'm good with that. There's already the one at Goldfish Farm. I imagine that would just be adjusted accordingly, but I think this looks reasonable.
Councillor Kopczynski, I also agree that it does look reasonable, but I don't think it's unreasonable to think that we could delay the actual formal implementation of it simply because we don't know what's going to be happening down the road with the development, and that's going to be one of the big drivers of how this all comes about. So if the development doesn't happen as we anticipate or are hoping to have it happen, that could in theory impact how that design would need to be changed. So, and since it is going to be so long, literally, for ODOT figure out how it's going to get funded, because we're just in competition with all the other communities for that funding. I don't think, putting this, together and say, this is good, we're going to sign off on it, but put it on the shelf and wait until things actually start to flesh out before we actually pull the trigger on something.
That's something that you finished my thought for me, Ray. Thank you for saying that. There was some discussion earlier today via email, concerns about the cost of all the infrastructure that's going to need to be put in to do anything over here, underground, above ground, and so on. And clearly development will drive that. We're not saying these things are going to be built right this way, right this now, because it's not going to happen until somebody makes an investment and says, we want to do this on this spot. Correct? But it's, it's best to have a plan.
Absolutely.
Hold on. Let's go with Ann and then Diane and then the mayor.
Yeah. And I really apologize that Ron isn't here, but I think the reason for getting your input is that we do need to propose amendments to the transportation systems plan. And this is not something identified in that plan. And I will say that there are road connections that are in the plan, and they've been in the plan for, this plan is 2010, that still haven't happened. So it is a long range plan. And actually the city is getting ready to update that master plan or do a new one. But we want some direction for what to include in this plan, but some of that implementation would be delayed, but it would be impacting what is included in other plans that would help implement the overall East Albany area plan. So I just wanted to clarify that, and would love to hear more comments.
Okay, Diane.
Thank you. So Ron Irish spoke with us about this at a previous meeting, and it's not ideal, but it sounds like the best option we have. However, I'm wondering why Price Road would have to end in a dead end. How come we can't leave it as it is?
I don't know whether it would be that in the end, and Ron would really have to answer that. And I just know that our streets plan shows it dead ending over time. I think it's probably dependent on the final traffic intersection design and the proximity of that on-ramp to Price Road, and whether there's any ability to have any movement at Price Road and Highway 20 at that time. So.
And I think our traffic model, just very briefly, assumes right in, right out here, as opposed to no connection at all. I think that's what we model as part of this process. And again, that reflects kind of the proximity to the I-5 interchange there.
So I have a couple things. One, if you present us a slide, it should be in the packet with the materials that we receive. So this packet is not, this particular drawing is not in here. The second thing is that I'm looking at this on the Three Lakes Road. And I do know that the developer is going to build 41 shotgun homes and 120 apartments. And that I'd like to see what it looks like on Three Lakes Road further down, further south, because they're probably, the way I saw their drawings, they have an exit on the Spicer Road. And so I was hoping that would be shown here in this particular drawing.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Steph.
I have a quick question. I know we have some proposed trails and path framework, which include biking trails. I'm wondering if we're considering on any of these new roads, protected bike lanes, or maybe even breaking out and showing like where bike lanes would be at as an alternative mode of transportation.
So I'll just kind of quickly say, yes, we are looking at potentially protected bike lanes in some areas. And the next couple of slides I'll show you in a moment actually shows some potential street cross sections for some of the different types of roadways in this area. And you'll see some of that on those. So we can talk a little bit more about that with the next couple of slides. In some cases, we haven't sort of gotten down to the level of detail of saying exactly which streets we assume would have protected bike lanes versus off-street pathways, or there may be some low volume streets. And again, I'll show you a picture of that in a moment, where there would be some shared bike and car lanes, but those would be on lower volume streets. So yeah, so that's kind of a quick answer to that. I think in terms of the this graphic, we have shown it to you and others in previous presentations. If it hasn't made its way into our actual draft planning documents, I agree we'd want to get it in there as we move forward. So thanks for the comment on that. And then in terms of the question about what we see on Three Lakes Road, we can go back and look at one of the previous slides just to see what it's showing for the street network there. But we may not be showing that in as much detail as you're looking for at this point. So those are just kind of some responses to what I heard a moment ago.
And in response to the mayor's question on Three Lakes Road, the development that's going in down there, they won't have a connection out to Spicer. They'll be connecting right to Three Lakes. It doesn't go that deep. And, this is really a zoomed in version of what was already in your packet for the street framework. Primarily focusing on the circulation changes, where Three Lakes, we're not proposing any changes down in that area.
So there's gonna be egress and ingress on Three Lakes Road from that development?
Correct.
Good to see that. Okay, thank you.
Any more questions? Comments? Okay, Matt. Move ahead.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to show you the next thing I'm going to present are some different kind of conceptual street designs for different types of roadways in the area. I'll talk about those a little bit. So we'll start out with Highway 20. And so I think, one of the things we've talked about during this process is not just that new facilities do a better job of kind of supporting all users, but that there are some recommended improvements to existing facilities to do the same thing. So this is a cross section for Highway 20. So what you're seeing here is kind of continued 2 travel lanes in each direction, a center turn lane, and then this does include buffered bike lanes on each side of the street. So the buffering is done in part because those are raised above the roadways with a pretty visible curb there. And so that's sort of one type of what I would call protected bike lane. It's not a barrier, but there is that curb to provide that transition. And then it's showing a landscape strip and sidewalk. So, the intent here is really to serve kind of all different types of travelers. This is a state facility. So, ultimate implementation of this would need to be coordinated with ODOT. And the other thing I'll note is you're seeing some relatively wide travel lanes. In some cases, this is a state freight route. So it's important to address those needs on this roadway. I think from what I understand from the transportation consultants, there is some flexibility on some of the dimensions of things you see here, including the travel lanes. But this is what we're recommending is at least, a starting point for Highway 20 through the area. So that's that one, and I'll show you some other cross sections, and then again, just kind of pause and see if you have any questions or comments. So one of the roadways you saw was the extension of Timber Ridge. What we're showing for kind of a street design there are travel lane in each direction, and then essentially a buffered bike facility. So you've got the bike facility and a couple of feet of sort of buffering using striping in this illustration. You're seeing parking on one side of the street where if there are businesses that need or require parking to access them, you'd see parking on one side, and then again sidewalks and planting strips along that roadway. And I think the assumption is that this street is going to carry enough traffic that you want to separate the bicyclists from the travel lanes and provide those kind of buffered bike lanes or protected bike lane facilities here. So that's that one. There are a number of streets that we're showing within the study area that kind of fall under this category of, I'll say, east-west collector. And depending on how much traffic those streets would carry and the kind of the speed of traffic along those streets, we're showing some different treatments in terms of And so this is would be a potential treatment for a street with lower traffic volumes and slower speeds, where bicyclists and vehicles would share the roadway. You would potentially have parking on each side of the street, but curb extensions or bulb outs, they're also called, to help people walking or pedestrians getting across the street, to make that crossing shorter for them, to make them more visible to vehicles, and fairly generous sidewalks in an area like this so that you'd have some opportunities for outdoor seating and things of that nature. So that's one kind of east-west connector option or concept. This is a second one where if you've got areas where there's essentially development or buildings on one side of the street, but more open space areas on the other side of the street. That's kind of what you're seeing here on the kind of the right side of the graphic, is a more of an open space condition. The sidewalk might meander a little bit. It's going in that case, through more of an open space area. But in other respects, it's pretty similar to what you saw in the last graphic. And then I think I've got one more of these east-west connector streets. To the extent that some of these streets have higher traffic volumes, and it is important to provide some more safety and comfort for bicyclists in this option or concept, you've got the bicyclists separated in, again, a buffered bike lane between the travel lanes and the on-street parking. And then in other ways, this one's pretty similar to the one you saw a couple slides back. But it's a little wider, requires more right away for that. And let's see, I'm gonna see if I have one more of these or not. Nope. So I'm gonna go back up here and I'm gonna just repeat some comments that that Ron Irish made to our committee, which is that where we have new roads coming through areas, we're really gonna be looking to develop or design to something like these cross sections we're showing you or something similar. But there's some roads where there are existing roads, you only have so much right away. We may not be able to get all the way to some of what we're showing here. So there's going to need to be a certain amount of flexibility in what we can ultimately do, depending on how much right away the city has and where buildings and other land uses are located in those areas. So we've kind of, these represent the goal, or I guess the ideal. May not be realistic to achieve that everywhere in this area, particularly when we're improving new roadways. So I just want to note that. And again, I'll take a little pause, take a breath, and just see if you have any questions or comments on these street designs. Love to hear if these make sense to you, if you like them, or if you have concerns about them. And I'm interested if this answered the question about protected bike lanes as well.
Hey, yes, I do. So Matt, I was noticing that you were using the term buffered bikeway to explain, to characterize all of the bikeways that were present in the slides. I was noticing there was one that you called a buffered bikeway, but it looked like it appeared to have more of like a vertical separation element, which would be characterized like there's a report by People for Bikes, their report they published, I believe, out in 2017 or 2018. But if it has a physical vertical separation element, it's considered a protected bike lane versus a buffered bike lane, which is just more space than the standard bikeway we see normally here in America. So I just wanted to clarify, are we doing more of a protected element like this one that you have right here on the screen? Or are we doing, I just want to clarify and see what is the actual plan for bikeways? Is it protected or buffer, or is it a mix of both?
So in particular on Highway 20, we showed what you're defining as a protected bike lane. It does say buffered bike lane here, but really it is, this is showing that kind of vertical curb or physical separation there. So this one in particular, we are thinking about a protected bike lane as opposed to just a buffer of a couple of feet that's striped. On some of the other graphics, what we showed was generally more of a buffered bike lane with the separation really just being primarily striping, but that doesn't mean you couldn't have in some of these cases a similar treatment to what I showed on the previous slide, that the bike lane could be raised and you could provide some additional protection and safety in that way. And exactly on which streets we might do one or the other, we haven't really gotten to that level of detail. So I think there is a certain amount of flexibility in how and where you do this. And a lot of times when that happens is when you get into a more detailed street design or corridor design process. So, I think we probably want to be just clear, A, in the report about what we mean with the terms, and B, note where there might be some flexibility in terms of future more detailed design and planning on some of these roadways, and kind of where the conditions are going to maybe merit one approach or another. And a lot of that's going to have to do with speed and volume of traffic to some degree. It's also going to depend on money, and what the city can afford to build. So I don't know, I know that's not a perfect answer, but does that help answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
And
Yeah, absolutely.
I would just add that the most important, what these cross sections are trying to show is generally travel lanes, parking, spaces for bicycles and pedestrians. We're really interested at a city in knowing what the right of way width is, but then there will be options for how a protected or buffered bike lane might be developed. And so according to Ron and our transportation plan, really the most important thing we need to do is sort of nail down the right of way needs. And then those designs can, as Matt already said, sort of go along with development and budget. But, developers end up building a lot of these streets. And so they do refer to the right of way width and acquiring those. But we know that the thing we need is right of way, and what happens within that right of way over time may change as we have lighter weight vehicles and, vehicles that are a little bit different. So the important is that we're trying to provide for all modes and types and then get that right of way width.
And
Certainly.
Councilor Newton, just to your point, when we talk about the difference between protected and buffered and where we would use them and where we wouldn't. And in this picture, for example, you potentially could use a protected bike lane on the right-hand side where you're not going to have as many driveway entrances. Obviously, when you have a protected bike lane, that makes it very difficult for cars to get in and out. So that's where you would use a buffered lane. So there's, to Ann's point, is the critical path is the right of way. We'll get into the kind of nuts and bolts when the development's getting closer.
I just had a follow-up from what Councilor Newton also said too, because of the east-west connectors, there's 3 different options here. So thinking about like Goldfish Road, if it's going to be buffered versus protected, and it's a very high-speed area. So I think it's something to probably consider when we start to get into the nuts and bolts.
Yeah, their speed is a factor in all of these road designs. And then for an existing road, and Matt said this and Ron isn't here to say it, but we don't have adequate right of way to do everything we want through the whole stretch of Goldfish Farm Road, for example. So it's going to have multiple, a few different cross sections depending on the amount of right of way that is available. But when new development goes in, we try to acquire the right of way that is in the transportation systems plan for that level of street. So.
any more questions or comments? All righty, Matt.
All right, thank you. So next thing I'm going to talk about is other types of infrastructure. So I'll talk about water, wastewater, and sewer infrastructure. In this case, I'm sort of channeling the civil engineers. We have a firm called Keller Associates on our team, and they did this work at our meeting last week. Stacy Belcastro was there, and so she had some she just kind of noted that, yeah, what we're presenting here is consistent with sort of the city's master plans on that. So I'll just mention that. So kind of a couple of things just generally that I want to say about that apply to all three of these things. So the city does have facility master plans for water, for wastewater, for stormwater. In those have been updated sort of at different periods of time. We looked at those and built off of those for all of the work that you're going to see on these next few slides. And in a number of cases, what we're showing you is already kind of in the plan for your infrastructure facility plans. So some things are already in the plan, other things are not. What we did was take a look at, based on the level of development in this area, what types of facilities would be needed to convey and store the water, for example, and to convey wastewater and to manage and treat stormwater in the area. So some of the things I say about each of these facilities will be sort of similar. So in terms of water lines, we essentially identified the need for larger water lines, and they tend to parallel the larger scale streets that we showed you in the street plan earlier, the kind of collector or arterial level streets. So this map and this table is just summarizing the quantity or the length of different size pipes, 12-inch, 16-inch, and 24-inch water pipes. It's also identifying 2 reservoirs in the Knox Butte area. Those reservoirs are already identified as needed long-term facilities in your water system plan. So those aren't new to this study area. They'd be needed regardless of whether of kind of exactly what we show in the East Albany plan in terms of future growth and development. But some of these pipes are new, are not already in your facility master plan. And so that's one of the things that will need to be done in terms of implementing this plan, is to update those facility master plans to add some of these projects so that they're in the plan, identify the approximate timing of them, and then ultimately take a look at your system development charges and make sure they're reflecting the types of facilities that are needed in the future. So this is just sort of summing up the costs of some of those water facilities and showing you a map of where they're located. This just zooms in them on the map a little bit more, so you can see the locations of those reservoirs and also the locations of the different size pipes that would be needed to convey water in this area. So that's kind of what we're showing here. Then the next couple slides do the same thing for wastewater facilities. So again, we're identifying the size and location of those larger scale wastewater pipes, and then also lift stations where gravity isn't enough to get the wastewater to flow where you want it. You need lift stations to get it from one location to another. So there are a number of pipes and lift stations identified within this area, again, to meet those long-term development capacity assumptions that we're showing in the East Albany plan. And then this is a map, again, showing the locations of the pipes and the lift stations that we showed or that we summed up the cost for on the last slide. So again, some of these are already in your wastewater master plan. Others are new based on the updated development assumptions that we have for the East Albany area. The other thing I'll just note real quickly here is that these are, again, kind of the larger scale conveyance pipes in areas where you used to have local streets and smaller pipes that are just serving the homes in those areas. Those are typically put in and paid for by development at the time that development occurs. So we didn't show all of those pipes on these plans, but that gets done in sort of a different way. Those smaller pipes that are part of a neighborhood or a subdivision development process get dealt with at that time rather than added to your facility master plans. So I'll just note that. And then a couple slides on the stormwater system. So again, we're building on your existing stormwater master plan, and you've already got some issues or deficiencies related to stormwater management that plan already talks about and addresses and identifies needed facilities for in the 3 different basins that are impacted by what occurs in East Albany. So this table and map are just showing you the location of the basins and then also summing up the potential cost of facilities for stormwater. And so essentially, there's a couple things that would be needed in terms of stormwater. One, some of the additional development and impervious surface that's created through development would kind of, I guess, escalate or exacerbate some of the deficiencies you already have identified. So it just, says, hey, you're going to need to continue to deal with those existing deficiencies. And then also build some additional facilities. In large part, those are pipes that get put in as part of the transportation system improvements, as well as some kind of non-piped, more natural stormwater management facilities as development occurs. So that's a quick summary of the stormwater system improvements. This is just, again, a map showing you in red where those future facilities would be needed, and the green are generally the locations of existing stormwater facilities. And I won't get this quite right, but Stacy mentioned in our meeting last week, there's an area not far from I-5 where you're already making some improvements or getting ready to make some improvements to address some deficiency over there. So that's kind of in process. So again, I'll take a pause there and just see if you all have any questions or comments. And if I cannot answer them, then we may need to get back to you with the responses to that, but I'll do my best.
Any comments or questions? No comments or questions.
Awesome. Okay. I think I am turning it over to, that's just kind of a repeat of the slide you saw earlier. And then I am going to turn it over to Andrew to cover the next part of the presentation.
All right, thank you, Matt. My name is Andrew Parrish. I also work for MIG. I'm here to give Matt a little bit of a break. I'm going to be talking about the comprehensive plan and zoning kind of implications of this plan. So just to recap, the goals that we're trying to achieve through these amendments are on the screen here. So we want to create a set of diverse and connected neighborhoods. We want to make a functional and safe multimodal transportation system that connects those neighborhoods, as well as a connected greenway trail system that takes advantage of the natural resources in the area, makes some really nice connections for people who are walking and biking. We want to further the city's economic development goals. We want to achieve housing variety, and we want to make this a plan that is implementable so that we know what we're doing going forward. So next slide, please. So the materials in your packet have outlined a series of comprehensive plan map amendments. So these are basically changing the colors on the map to replace the urban residential reserve designation that's in East Albany today, which is a fairly broad designation that doesn't provide a lot of certainty to property owners. So we want to change that to either residential or employment or mixed use designations so that folks know what's going to be happening on that property. And then there's a set of zoning map amendments that are going to be consistent with those new comprehensive plan designations. But we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, and we want to make sure that we have conversations with property owners so that we're not doing anything that they're not comfortable with. So there's kind of the higher level comprehensive plan effort, and then there's the more detailed zoning effort that is underway. So we we kind of have maps for the former, less information for the latter. So next slide here. So you'll see on this slide, we have the existing.
Reconvening. There you go. Thanks, Andrew. We're back.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So what you're seeing on your screen right now is the existing comprehensive plan and the existing zoning designations for East Albany. On the comprehensive plan map on your left, the thing to note is these bright green areas. That is the urban residential reserve designation that you have that you have today. And part of the purpose of this plan is to replace that designation with things that are a little bit more in line with the plan for the area in the future. So so that designation is really broad today. It doesn't provide a lot of certainty to property owners. It doesn't tell the city what kinds of investments might be needed to support it. So part of this process has been to refine that a little bit further. On the right, you'll see the existing zoning map that only encompasses land that is inside the city today. And the areas outside of that zoning map are they have comprehensive plan designations, but don't have a zoning designation today. So basically, when a property will annex into the city of Albany, that's when it would get that zoning designation. So the next slide. Let me get my screen here so that I can see what that slide is. So this is, I believe was in your packet. This is a summary of comprehensive plan designations with some numbers there that show what the area was previously. For the most part, those are areas that were that light green color, the urban residential reserve, but there are a couple of changes that are suggested as part of this plan, including the area around the roundabout today on Knox Butte. There is one portion of that is recommended to go to a commercial designation just to ensure that there is something other than residential that happens at that roundabout. And let's see what else is worth mentioning here. Some of the areas are proposed to be changed from light industrial to a kind of broader employment designation. And these suggestions are all kind of in part with they're all being conducted along with discussions with property owners, with kind of the broader planning effort underway. So and as part of the final document, we're expecting to provide more detailed maps for individual property owners so they know what's going to happen to their property specifically. Next slide, please. So in addition to the map amendments, we have some text amendments that are going to take effect in the development code. One of them is the addition of a new residential high density zone that is at 25 units to 50 units an acre. These are for the more kind of mixed use node areas, the more areas of activity that we foresee in the East Albany area. There are also some changes to the mixed use residential, the village mixed use designation. These are generally to require a mix of uses rather than allowing kind of single uses to occur on these sites. So in mixed use residential, the changes are to say you can develop a commercial use, but you need to have a primary residential use on the site. And vice versa, the mixed use commercial zone is, or the mixed use commercial use is indicated to say that you need a new residential use on the site. So a primary residential use on the site. So basically requiring that the designation has a primary use and a secondary use. For the employment zone, we are suggesting a new employment zone allowing a range of office uses and limited manufacturing and high tech and research uses. And that's a change to the use category designation on in your development code today. So these are basically allowing employment uses that are kind of more up to date, more modern, less obnoxious neighbors, I guess. And yeah, so these are the development code amendments that we're suggesting today. So I'm going to pass it back over to Matt to round us out with next steps and take any questions that you all have.
And I guess I'll just ask, Ann, do you have anything to add on the proposed comp plan and code amendments before we move on? And then just see if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, I think it, just for those of you that are referring to your packet, page 43 has sort of a matrix that I think helps explain. I mean, just for especially for those that are new serving here, the comprehensive plan is a long range plan. It's a little more broader brush, and the zoning districts implement the comprehensive plan. But there isn't necessarily one zoning district that implements the comprehensive plan. It could be multiple zoning districts. So we are proposing to add 2 new zones to help us round out the options and opportunities in East Albany. One of those being a new high density residential zone. Currently, our higher density zones allow development up to 35 units an acre maximum. Some mixed use zones would allow for more. And then the new employment zone is, I think Andrew described it well, it would allow for a lot of the industrial and office type uses that corporate offices or high tech, but warehousing, a variety of uses, but those that are clean and don't have environmental impacts. Well, the one thing I just wanted to clarify is we have an existing mixed use residential zone and a mixed use commercial zone. These are some of the zones that may implement some of the village mixed use or neighborhood village comprehensive plan or land use plan designations. And the idea is that for mixed use residential, we wouldn't want all of that land to go commercial. It could all be residential, but if it was going to be commercial, we would want it to have a mix of residential and commercial, and then vice versa with commercial. The mixed use commercial could be all commercial, but it couldn't be all residential, which is what we're seeing at the roundabout. That area is all zoned at Knox Butte roundabout. I know we have more than one roundabout in Albany now, but the Knox Butte roundabout is zoned mixed use commercial, all that land around it mostly, and all of it's gone residential. We were really hoping to have some commercial there, for example. So what we're trying to figure out is how can we avoid that from happening in the future, at least in East Albany? So there may be some confusion, but in your packet, starting, I think like pages 50 and to the end, you've got some examples that some of the Albany Development Code chapters are included, and it specifies some of the uses that we're proposing would be allowed in these new zones and some of those changes. That's why your packet is fairly lengthy, that we are trying to show you what actual amendments we would be making when we go to adoption.
Yeah, so any questions or comments on any of that? The last couple of slides I have are going to talk about funding strategies or sources, and then just kind of round out with next steps. But before I do that, does anybody have any questions on what you heard from Andrew and Ann?
Karen does. Go.
Could I have an example of a technological production business? You mean like Amazon or Dell? Or
I would say a small scale manufacturer that is making drones, something along those lines, you know, like kind of a there's manufacturing going on. There might be some high-tech offices kind of as part of that, but probably fairly small scale is my imagining of it.
Or we could have HP, like you drive by in Corvallis, something like that. So really, the diversity in size and scale, there is no minimum or maximum size for these developments. The idea is to capture any employer that is actually providing jobs, which is why we thought we'd use the unique term of employment for this zone, and but allow for a variety of employer types as long as they are don't have the negative environmental impacts. So you could see offices. It could be a corporate office, a headquarters for any business next to a warehousing and distribution center, or a regular manufacturer that might do like Pacific Cast Technologies or something like that.
Any more questions, comments? Alrighty.
Okay, so just kind of a couple more things to touch on. So one is possible funding sources. So one of the memos that we sent out to y'all describes different strategies for paying for particularly the types of public improvements that are described in the memos and will be described in the East Albany plan. So I'm just going to kind of briefly note what some of these are. We haven't sort of identified exactly what funding source would be used to pay for exactly what type of facility, but there is some general information in the funding memo about that. So I'll just kind of run through these again, see if you have any questions or comments on this. So systems development charges, I think a lot of you are familiar with those, I'm sure. Those are charges that are assessed at the time development occurs, and they can be used to pay for the cost of facilities necessitated by new growth. So you have systems development charge fees for water and wastewater and transportation and parks and recreation. So that's clearly, a pretty typical type of way to fund, particularly infrastructure projects. And one of the things that tends to happen as part of implementation of a plan like this is to go back into the facility plans that identify future capital improvements for each of those types of facilities, update those CIP lists, because those capital project lists are the basis for your SDC rates and fees. So that's one of the things that the city would need to do and want to do as an outcome of this plan, would be to update those plans and see if any adjustments to your SDC rates or fees are warranted to help pay for the cost of these facilities. So that's one. State funding. We've got a couple of state highways through this area. And so that's a source of funding for improvements to those roadways or those facilities. Tax increment financing. That's otherwise often referred to as urban renewal. You have a tax increment financing district now in the downtown area, the Central Albany renewal area, CARA, and use that to pay for different types of public improvements. You have the ability in there's some state kind of sideboards on how much of an area within a city can be within a tax increment financing district. So you have some capacity if you wanted to establish a new district within East Albany, a portion of East Albany, and that could be used to also pay for improvements in this area. The way that mechanism works is the increase in assessed value within the district is then used to pay for improvements within that district rather than being spread throughout the entire city. So that's a pretty common tool to pay for improvements in a specific area. Local improvement districts, that's something you could also do, particularly in more kind of existing built out areas. They tend to be used for sort of smaller scale, more localized improvements. Local improvement districts require property owners to sign on to that, to approve that. So they tend to be more used again for more localized things. Bonds or levies, often used for either large capital projects or for maintenance of certain types of facilities in the case of levies. So those are sometimes used for instance, new parks in a city or new schools or renovations to existing schools. And they can be used for other types of facilities as well. So that's another potential funding source, kind of long-term. Construction excise tax, for those of you that have been participating in the Housing Affordability Task Force, that's one of the tools or strategies we've talked about in that process as a way to help pay for housing affordable to folks in particularly income ranges. So that could be applied in this area as well, if that's something that you pursue on kind of a larger citywide basis. Developer funded projects, I mentioned this earlier, but as development occurs, typically developers are paying for and providing certain types of improvements. So particularly local streets and the infrastructure within those streets, as well as trails and pathways within a specific area that are serving those areas. Those are, almost all end up being funded through the development process. And then of course, state and federal grants. And I would say particularly for parks and trails, that's an important source of funding, can be used for other types of facilities too. So that's kind of the range of different types of funding tools and sources and strategies that may be used to help pay for these improvements in the East Albany area. So I'll just kind of stop there, see if you have any questions or comments on that. And before I wrap us up with next steps.
No comments or questions.
All righty. So kind of the last slide here is just to talk a little bit about next steps. And I actually started the presentation off with some of this because I wanted to give you a sense of what was ahead. So again, we provided you with this series of memos in advance of this meeting. So we'll need to update those memos to the extent, there's comments, questions, changes. We heard a number of comments and questions from our advisory committee last week. So there will be, and there's just some things that we need to flesh out a little bit more in those memos. So we will be updating those memos to do that. And then the information in those memos and in a lot of the stuff that preceded it that we've presented in earlier work sessions with y'all and meetings will get folded into that draft East Albany plan. One of the documents we included in the packet was an outline of that plan and sort of a general description of the graphic format of that plan. So that's one of our fairly immediate next steps is to draft that combined document. And then conduct some additional community outreach, make that plan available to people through the project webpage, by letting folks on our interested parties email list know, by encouraging you all to let your constituents know that we've got a draft of this plan ready to review, and we want to get comments on that, and then go through the adoption hearing process with y'all. So we are tentatively scheduled for adoption hearings in March with the Planning Commission and April with the council. In each case, we've got 2 meetings kind of on the calendar. And that would include the East Albany plan and also amendments to the comprehensive plan and potentially the code amendments that we talked about as well. Again, I think the plan generally for the zoning ordinance amendments is to make sure we've done enough outreach with specific property owners before proceeding with those. And the zoning map amendments needed to implement plan designations in areas that are currently outside the city limits, but within the urban growth boundary, those would happen later as the area annexes. And that's a big part of implementation as well, is future annexation. And that's generally a property owner driven process. You know, the city isn't planning. Somebody asked us at our advisory committee meeting, is the city planning to go out and annex these areas now? No, that's not the plan. It's really driven by applications and requests. So that's part of that long-term implementation, as is, you know, seeing development proceed, and just, you know, finding ways to implement all these things. So that's kind of both sort of shorter term and long-term next steps. Any questions on any of that before we let you go?
There's no questions.
All right, y'all made it pretty easy on me tonight in terms of the questions, but if, or not too many of them. So, but if you have any more questions, you know, you get out of this meeting and say, oh, I really should have asked Matt or Ann or Andrew one of these questions, just be sure you let Ann know, because she can then forward them on to us. If, you know, she'll probably just answer them, but if she needs to send them to us, she'll do that and we can get back to you. And just want to thank you all for your time tonight. I know you had an earlier meeting, so made it for a long meeting today. So thank you. And we'll look forward to seeing you again before too long when we get to those adoption hearings.
Yeah, I just want to say that things are moving really fast with this plan. So we have to do a lot of public notice and far in advance of when your public hearings would start. And so if you do have comments and questions, and we would like to meet with you in person, especially if you do, if you could think about those over the next week, that would be helpful. And some of the materials, I mean, they still have draft all over them. We are still just making sure everything is accurate and correct, and, you know, adding some ideas or whatever in some cases. But like I said, it's coming together fairly fast, but implementation is going to take a really long time. And Matthew and I sent out over 30 letters on Friday to property owners that, would you like us to rezone your property with us? And then I sent out a bunch more emails. And so we're trying to do our due diligence and meet with property owners that may be affected, that are in the city limits where we're proposing change. And before we just do this last round of public input through public hearings. So we're available, and we would love to provide more background for you or answer your questions so that we get this as best as we can as it moves through that hearing process. And one more thing, I don't remember if I put it on the agenda, but you're going to see a lot of me, maybe a lot of Matt and Andrew. And anyway, in 2 weeks, you won't see Matt and Andrew, they're going to get a break. In 2 weeks, we do have another joint work session. So you're going to see a lot of each other because we have climate friendly area work that is upon us. And then we are also working on housing implementation plan. So you're going to see a lot of us, which is great. I'm not going to bring granola bars every time, but they'll be good.
I have a question with a yes or no answer. We're working on an island annexation package at the moment. Are some of those islands in this area?
Yep. So that is going to be scheduled right after any map amendments are made in the area, so that the annexation, they would have their new comprehensive plan designation if it changed. And then the zoning that would be applied would be one of the zones that is compatible with that comprehensive plan designation based on this plan. Yep.
So, and we have a meeting in 2 weeks.
February 13th, the day before Valentine's Day. So I hope you don't have your Sybaris reservations on Monday night, but yes, February 13th, 5:30, I think.
5:30.
Or no, maybe 5:15.
5:15. Okay, well, thank you. And if there's no other questions or comments, Cersei?
So I apologize because I am newer to this process, but I was involved looking from the public perspective. And because I'm a data scientist, I am curious if there is available metadata with the layers to be able to use in like ArcMap or ArcGIS to look where the existing infrastructure is and where the change is going to be. Because just looking at some of the breakdowns of it, it's kind of hard to visualize where some of those existing infrastructures are.
I'll go ahead and take a shot at that. Yes, we do have that information in GIS. And we can provide it to you through the city for sure.
Any more comments, questions? Alrighty, well then we are adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Yep, 3 minutes early, even with our